Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Sorry I can't be there in person today, but I've made you a tutorial to help explain some of the basics of colour grading and colour correction. I hope that your editing is going well and your videos are coming along and you're getting to grips with Adobe because we'll be using Adobe for this process as well. So let's get to it. What is colour grading and what is colour correction? So colour correction is basically making sure all of your clips look the same in terms of settings such as exposure, white balance, things like that. You probably will shoot different clips in different locations and different light sources, so your clips will look different. Making sure that they all look the same gives your video a better overall look, makes it flow better, makes it look more professional. So that's colour correction. Colour grading is the creative side of the process. You can give your video a certain look with your colour scheme, certain emotional feel, lots of different things you can achieve here. This is where you can get artistic and creative. So I'll just explain a couple of popular colour schemes which you'll recognise. I like to keep a colour wheel with me just so that I can see which colours oppose each other on the colour wheel, which colours are next to each other, because this really helps with the process. You have the complementary colour scheme. This takes two colours from opposite sides of the colour wheel. These colours contrast each other but also work harmoniously. An example of this is teal and orange. This is really, really popular in Hollywood. It's a really cinematic effect that you get from using these two colours. It's popular with action movies and sci-fis. And any colours that are opposite each other on the colour wheel, they actually contrast each other in really effective ways. So you can play about with this with any other colours. It doesn't have to be teal and orange. Another colour scheme is the Analogous colour scheme. This uses colours that sit next to each other on the colour wheel. This gives a warmer, more softer look. It's not as dramatic. And here are some examples of some other colour schemes if you want to look even further into this. There's a whole science of emotion behind colour and why we use colour in film, in photography, in art. I've just read the book If It's Purple, Someone's Gonna Die: The Power of Colour in Visual Storytelling by Patti Ballantoni. And she talks about in this book colour theory and the use of colour in film and how effective this is to create different emotions and make the audience feel certain things and tell the story more effectively through the use of colour. Because we have all these different associations with different colours. The book is really well written. She talks about each colour separately and the different associations and effects that that colour can have. So, for example, blue can be a very calming colour. Green is a colour that represents life. Green is all around us in plants, in nature, but green can also represent poison and death. So it can have two very different meanings. Red can be passion and love, and it can also be anger. Red is a really strong colour that has really strong associations. Orange can be warm and homely and comforting, but you can also use orange in the sky, and that can represent a poisonous atmosphere. For example, in Blade Runner, there's a very orange hue in the sky, which represents the pollution and the poisoned atmosphere. Colour determines how we think and how we feel, and also our behaviours. Even a slight variation in colour can have a profound influence on our behaviour. It's used to manipulate the audience, and it's also used in character development and in costumes. If you learn more about colour theory and begin to understand it, it will be a really effective tool in your filmmaking, and it will ultimately make you a better storyteller. Although it's important to understand these different associations for different colours and colour theory, it's also important to remember that you can use these associations as springboards, depending on the context of the film you're making. You don't need to stick to rigid guidelines, like have fun with it, be experimental. This is the best way to learn, is to just play around with different things and see what works for you as well. And this is when you'll create your own style and your own colour flair, and that's where you'll stand out. So yeah, don't be afraid to break the rules as well, because it's all about breaking the rules, guys. Okay, so now we've gone through the basics of colour theory and we've explained a little bit about colour correction and colour grading. You kind of have an idea. So we're going to go into Premiere. We're going to go into your colour workspace, which is up here next to editing. So click on here and your layout will look a little bit different than normal. Some of you may have used this tab already, you may be familiar with it, some of you may have no idea, so just don't worry. It's all really simple once you get to know it. On your top left hand corner you've got your Lumetri Scopes. If you don't see them, then you may just have to toggle some of these tabs. They're just here on the Lumetri Scopes. Here you've got your preview where you see the clip that you're working on. On the right hand side here you have the Lumetri colour panel, which is where you'll be able to do your basic colour corrections, and you can get more creative with your grade. So it all goes on here. Some of the basic terms which we use to describe colour are as follows. So you have hue, which is what we call colours, saturation, which is the intensity or the vividness of the colour, and luma, which is the brightness or the shade of hue. Let's go back to the Lumetri Scopes for a minute so I can just explain these to you. They may look a bit confusing now, but they do make sense and they are really useful when you come to correcting the colour in your image. So let me show you, in this clip I had some of my housemates do a little dance for you just so that it was a bit more interesting. You can see here, this first one, this is the waveform, and this directly corresponds to the video. So you can see as I move the video, there's movement in the waveform as well. So this is the exposure of your image. So this is used for exposure correction. If you have a very overexposed image, all of this white information will be here at the top, and if you have a very underexposed image, it will all be at the bottom. The key to realizing a well-exposed image is that all this information will be quite evenly spread out across the waveform graph. I'll give you an example now. If I up the exposure, you can see how the waveform moves to the top. If I take the exposure down, it moves to the bottom. This is a good way to just judge how well exposed your image is and if you need to do some corrections. Down here is the RGB parade. This is really helpful when you need to adjust your white balance. So I've got a clip here where I took an incorrect white balance. You can see that the green and the blue are much higher than the red. This is good for showing you which colours are out of balance, and this will be really useful when you adjust it later. This one here is the Vectorscope. It corresponds directly with the colour wheel, and you have all of the colours that are in your image here. This trace here shows you how saturated each colour is. As I'm on the video with a lot of green and blue in it, you can see how the trace is spread out over towards the green and the blue sides, the cyan sides of the colour wheel. This line in the middle here is sort of your rough estimation of where you want your saturated colours to be. Anything outside of that tends to be way too saturated. So here we can play with the saturation. As you see, I move the saturation down, so the trace moves down as well. You can see the image already looks a lot better. So that's a really helpful tool. Also, if you're working with skin tones, this line down the middle here, this is known as the blood line, and this is where your skin tones should sit. So if you have a close-up, a portrait close-up of a person, the trace should follow this line roughly, and if it doesn't, you can adjust your colours so that it's tighter to that line, and this is a more accurate representation of most skin tones. You'll notice that the video I have here is very flat and undersaturated. That's because I've changed my settings on my camera to shoot in a log format. Now I have a Sony, and each camera has its own specific log format. So mine for Sony is called S-Log, and this is something that you'll need to do a bit of research on for your particular camera and your particular settings. But it's basically a setting that reduces the saturation, reduces the contrast, and creates a very flat image, which looks really bad here, but it means that you've got much more options for color grading when you come to post-production. So because there's very little contrast, you've got a lot of detail in the blacks, you've got more detail in the shadows and the highlights, and this just makes it easier for you to have, you've got more creative freedom at the end of the day. So when you start adding colour later on, you'll find that it's much easier to start on a plain palette than on a palette that already has a lot of colour. For example, this one was not shot in a log format. Do a bit of research on your particular camera and the log format that will go with that, and you should be able to find something that will work for you. Here on the right hand side you have the Lumetri colour panel. I'll just expand it a bit more so you can see more clearly. You've got a few different tabs here. You've got your basic correction tab. You have the white balance selector where you can play around with the white balance. You have the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. So here you can make your image cooler, you can make it warmer, you can adjust the greens and the pinks. Here we can adjust the white balance a little better. You can see that the colours are changing. You can actually use this little dropper here, and you can click on something in the image that should be white, and it will correct the white balance for you as best as the AI in Premiere can, which is not always accurate, but it's quite a useful thing. So let me just go back, I'll show you that again. So click the little dropper and then find something on your image, some area that's white, and you can click that and it'll take this information and it'll give you the best white balance that the program can. So here the exposure, that can adjust the exposure of your image. As you see, the waveform changes as well. You've got contrast, the highlights and shadows. Highlights are everything that's bright in your image, so I tend to bring these down a little bit if I'm exposing the image a bit more, because the highlights always get burnt out. You've got the shadows as well, so you can lift this if you want the shadowy parts of your image to be less dark. You've got the whites. The whites are the whitest part of the image. These are the whites up on the scope here. The blacks are also the blackest part of your image, so if I lift the blacks, you can see we get a kind of washed out look. Usually you want your blacks to be very black. This helps with the contrast as well, so you can play around with that. You don't want to bring any of these down or up too much, because you'll just end up losing information in that area of the video, sorry. You can see as I've brought all the blacks down that we have the areas that are dark in the image are just really dark. So let's bring that back. Here you've got the saturation as well, so you can play around with that. Now I'm going to walk you through some basic corrections of this footage. This is footage that's had no correction done on it already. It's footage from the video that I made with collage art back in 2019. Lovely Rhoda here looking very glamorous. So we're going to start by taking the white balance dropper. We're going to find something white in the image and we're going to click it. There you go, you see that the dials have moved and the white balance has been adjusted a bit. The RGB parade has adjusted itself as well. See, the red is slightly higher than the rest of them, which in this case I think is fine because there's a lot more red in the image, so I think that's fine. Next I'm going to take the exposure, I'm going to lift the exposure a bit. I'm going to take the highlights and bring them down because when you lift the exposure it often blows out the image a bit. Shadows I'm going to lift a little bit as well. And as you can see here on our Vectorscope, we've got our colours are looking a little bit too saturated. I'm just going to try and take the saturation down a bit and see what it looks like. I think that's looking better for me to do some further adjustments on. You can go to the top here where it says FX next to Lumetri colour, and you can toggle this on and off to see what your image looked like before and after the adjustments. Now that we've got these basic adjustments done, we're going to add them to the next clip. So I've got 2 clips of Rhoda here. This one where we've done the small changes, I'm just going to press right click and copy, and on my next clip where I've not added any adjustments, I'm going to right click and paste attributes. Here you can see that we're pasting the Lumetri colour because there's a tick. If you've done other things to the clip like added some time remapping or motion graphics, it'll give you the option to copy these as well. You can select the effect that you want to copy so that you only copy one, or you can select multiple. And click OK, and that's copied the same effects that we had on the first clip to the second. Obviously this clip has a slightly different background and lighting, although I think these effects work quite well. Maybe we take the exposure down a bit, maybe lift the shadows a bit more. But I think that looks pretty good. This is really useful. You can copy, if you have the same clips, you can copy the adjustments that you do on one clip and paste them throughout all the same clips of your video. It saves loads of time. You don't have to be going through and adjusting each one individually. You can just copy and paste the stuff that you've done on the original one and it remains consistent. So as I watched the tutorial back, I realised I had moved on to a section and forgotten to tell you something important. So I'm putting it in now. Silly me. Sorry about that, guys. But before we go on to the next stage, we've done all the basic corrections, our colour correction on our individual clips. The next stage is colour grading, and I'm going to go on to talk about that in a minute. Talk about your Luts, your lookup tables, and the creative bit. But before you do that, you need to come down here and go on New Item and click Adjustment Layer. All these settings are fine, 1920 by 1080, 25 frames per second. Click OK. We're going to rename this Color Grade. So this is just an empty clip that you can put on top of your timeline. It's going to go over the entirety of your timeline. This is what you're going to do all your creative stuff on. This is so that you can affect all of your clips underneath. Super easy, you don't need to go through and do the grade on each individual clip, because once you've got all your clips looking exactly the same in terms of white balance and exposure, it should be fine to just place one colour grade over the top of it all, and you can check it out while you're editing as well, see what looks good and experiment with different things. So the adjustment layer on the top is very important, makes your life a lot easier and helps you keep organised in your workflow. You can then toggle it on and off here with the eyeball. Yeah, that's it. So now we're going to go on to talk about the Luts and the grading process. Next, let's go to Creative. Here you've got your Luts, which Luts stand for Lookup Table. Down here you have a drop-down menu with all the LUTs that Premiere Pro provides. You can also download your own LUTs from the internet. I know a really good website, it's called Fresh LUTs, and they're all free. You can preview them and they've got a massive selection for different types of video. If you download any from the internet, you can just keep them in a folder, click browse here, and then you can download them from your device. You've got this preview window here where you can preview the LUTs provided by Premiere. Here we've got like a sepia look. You can toggle the intensity here as well. Let's go through them a bit more. Lots of different looks. Expand this a bit more for you guys. Black and white. This is really good if you want a quick fix. You just want to add something to your video, but you don't have the time to do a big long color grading process. And it's also a good place to start as a beginner. I like to take the intensity down a bit because I think it's very easy to overdo it, and the video looks much more professional if the colours aren't overdone and it's just a subtle effect. Here, let's click on the effects at the top. We can see the before and after of this particular grade. Just to show you an example of something, I'm going to take the exposure right down on this clip. It's only going to be like this for a second. There's a really useful tool under Color Wheels and Match. Click Comparison View, and here you're able to see two shots side by side. You can toggle this bar to find where you want to be on the timeline, and then match it to whatever piece of footage your playhead is over in the timeline. You can also see that your Lumetri Scopes are doing the comparison view as well. This is our first clip and this is our second clip. You can see down on the RGB parade as well. So if you're struggling to match up clips, you can use the scopes as a reference. Here obviously we know that I just took down the exposure, but watch as I lift it and we can see that we're matching the Lumetri Scopes so that they look similar. Take down the highlights a bit. You want the information to look nearly exactly the same, or as much as you can get it. And there we go. I think that's pretty good. So this is really great to help you compare certain clips which are shot in different locations and under different light sources, and the scopes just give you a better idea of what you're doing in terms of looking at the information in the image. It's sometimes easier to see it in black and white than see it in the video itself. To get back out of the comparison view, you can just toggle the button here again. While we're in this tab, you can see we've got the shadows, midtones and highlights wheels here. So you can play around with the colours in the shadows, in the midtones and the highlights, add different hues to different parts of the image. So let's just play around here. We can try the teal and orange effect. So here I've put a bluey tealy tint to the shadows, and then as I add the orange you can see it neutralizes the image, but you still retain the sort of bluey tealy colour in the shadows. You can also add some orange to the highlights if you want to warm up the image. Double click on any of these wheels to reset them. So let's say we're just going to add some blues and maybe some pinks to this image. go for the Analogous colour scheme here. See what looks good. Maybe we like orange. I think I like orange. It makes her skin tone look good. It warms up the image a little bit. I think this is a good starting point. I want to show you another tab which is quite handy. So here under curves you can play with your curves just like in Photoshop. You can add some more contrast this way. You can use the RGB as well, so you can adjust the red, the greens and the blues. Double click to reset. Here you've got hue versus saturation, hue versus hue. These are all tables that adjust different parts of the colour. So this one adjusts the saturation. Click on the dropper and you can select any colour you want. We've selected pink. So you see these little dots, that's the selection it's made. You can grab the middle one and you can see the colour gets more intense at the top, and watch the image. That pink is getting really saturated now. Too saturated. Or you can desaturate it completely if you want to remove a certain colour from your image. So yeah, if we want to reduce the saturation, still see there's little bits of pink, hasn't quite captured everything. You can adjust these dots here as well to expand a bit more, and it should capture more of the colour. See, now it's kind of washing out a lot of the image because those are the particular colours that we're going for in this image. You can reset this by double clicking. Here as well you can adjust the hue, so let's click on the pink again. You can actually change the colour of the pink. Obviously it needs a bit of adjustment, but you get the gist. So we can make it blue. Obviously, as her lipstick is pink and other aspects of the image are pink, you'll be adjusting them as well. This one as well. Let's see, I can't really remember what this one does. So select the pink. Oh, so this is the brightness of the colour, the luma. See, that's adding all sorts of strange effects. You don't want to overdo any of this too much. Luma versus saturation. Here as well, you can play around with the intensity of the colours. And saturation versus saturation. Again, making it more saturated, making it less saturated. This is useful if you want to change the colour of someone's t-shirt, or you want to take away a certain colour in an image, or you want to make a colour really pop in an image. You can select it individually here, and that's quite useful. Quickly, I'm just going to go through some grading of the log footage that I showed you earlier. So we don't need to adjust the white balance here. We can take our blacks down a little bit to give some more contrast to the image. Take the highlights down a little bit, up the exposure, can add a little bit of saturation. Now let's go and add a LUT. So I'm just going to browse some of my LUTs. We'll try this one. Go back to some basic corrections as well. Take the highlights down a bit, take the whites down. Take the shadows down a bit so that you've got a bit more detail in there. It's starting to look good. Just scrub through the clip quickly. You can see they're looking much better. This is just a very quick example I'll show you on and off. But you've got much more room for editing the colours and things here as well. So I've added the same corrections to the second clip of Rhoda and the same LUT. I think it's looking nice. I really like the skin tones. There's some nice warm colours in the skin tones, some nice blues to contrast those warm colours. The contrast is looking good. I think we're ready to export. So I'm going to just place my in point here by pressing I on the keyboard, and put my out point here by pressing O on the keyboard, so that I'm just exporting this section. One last quick trick that I'm going to show you is that I always found when I was colour grading and then exporting my video that the colours in the exported video just weren't quite as rich as they were when I was doing it in Premiere. This was something I couldn't figure out for ages, but I saw a tutorial recently and found that if you go to Preferences and General, you have to click something, you have to check a box which changes here. So enable display color management under General. Check that box and press OK. You'll see that the colors seem to be way more intense now, and you're thinking, whoa, this doesn't look good. But trust me, just export it like this and it balances out for what is lost in the export. I think there must be information that just gets lost while Premiere's exporting it. It seems a bit silly. I don't really know why it happens, but if you make sure that you get that checked in General, that little box, then you should have a more accurate representation of what you've been working in the program when it's exported. So then we go to Command M for media. Sorry, my laptop's really slow. And then you can export it however you like. I'm just going to leave it on H.264, and we're going to have a high bit rate. We'll title it Color Grading, save it to the desktop, and then click Export. So I hope you found that really useful, guys. I'm sure you're going to have some questions, but I hope to answer them when I next see you. Yeah, just have loads of fun. I've attached some links to some of my favourite YouTube tutorials and the website where you can get some free LUTs as well. So I'll ask Sarah to send them over to you. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of creative looks you go for in your videos. So yeah, take care and I'll see you soon. Bye.